for many years, actually, I've thought of my poetry as telling pieces of a life. And I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking of like Wordsworth, the idea, or Whitman in another sense. As I got old, or Berryman, as I got older, what I'd like to do is to put it together into a narrative, or an implied narrative. And I talked to Barry Moser, the fellow who did the design. We talked about this years ago, and I said, I'm getting closer to it, and I had this chance right now. I was on sabbatical. I'm writing a biography of Wallace Stevens, but this is the second thing that was in my mind. And looking at Wallace Stevens, he was 75 when he died. I'm 72 now. I thought maybe this is a good time to put it together the way I'd like to put it together. And I wasn't sure quite how to do it, Brendan. I decided that I would take all my poems. I would just go through all of them and see how many, and I think altogether close to 400, okay? And then from those, new and old, etc., I'd say, okay, now how many deal with my childhood? And then how many deal with when I was a teenager? And how many deal with, meeting my wife and getting married and raising a family and teaching down the line? And, each of these. And I kept playing with the numbers. And finally, I said, well, Berryman's got 77 dream songs originally. So I said, suppose I go for 100 poems. And then I thought, okay. Then it broke down into decades. And so it came out to 8 12s. Numbers which have a significance for me, the dozen, and then the idea of the decade. And so it began to break it up that way. So from the time of my birth till 10 years old or 11 years old, and then to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 and on. And and that's how I began to make the choices for which poems would be included. Also, where poems had to be added in order to make that pattern work. And I worked on it for 4 or 5 months, and it became clearer and clearer. And then all of a sudden, I get an email from a fellow who says, "Look, Paul, I met you at a conference. I'm the editor of this series of poetry, Poema, Cascade." And he said, I'd like to do a book of yours if you've got a book. And they just came together. I had just received word that the Deaths and Transfigurations, that was pretty much sold, finished. They returned the copyright for the poems. And so then these things just came together. And it's not like it was a major publishing house, but they allowed me, what I liked about it was two things. One, they would allow me to do what I wanted to do, and so I could bring Barry Moser on board. And secondly, it was a Christian publishing house, which would allow me really to tell the kind of Augustinian, the story in the tradition of St. Augustine, the Confessions, to tell the story that way without receiving a great deal of flack. As we worked it out, a poem would be added or a poem would go. And then the final thing, I think, was the idea of revision, that I would go over these poems that I had written, many of them back in 1975, 1982, etc., look them over with, 45 years of teaching, a lot of them teaching writing classes, etc., plus all the writing that I'd done, and streamline them. In that sense, I think the example of William Carlos Williams, that less is more, was also influential. So I went over them and revised a good number of them. you say, well, what, should you revise an earlier poem? Should you? And I thought of, W.H. Auden doing this, and I thought of Robert Lowell doing this. And there are a number of poets who have gone back over their own material and said, this is what I would like it to look like. I've worked this, I've worked that, I've tried this, tried that, but this is what I would like it to look like. And so we got that, and I took Barry out to lunch, and I said, Barry, we talked about doing this project, and he's always in the middle of about 6 things, but he said, yeah, let's do this, let's do this. And he's such a generous guy. I mean, what would have cost $6,000-7,000 really to design and illustrate? He said, this is a gift. This is a gift. And so we talked. I said, I know this. I said, for the cover, I know I want to have something to do with the 3rd Avenue L. And growing up in New York City on 51st Street, it was a German-Irish neighborhood. We were the only Italian family on the block. I said, that's where it begins. And I said, at the end, I want an older man in some kind of a cathedral, walking in the darkness but towards a cross. I said, that would sum up, the alpha and the omega of it. And then he said, well, let's do another image, like a triptych. He loves to do these triptychs. And he said, I'll photograph you by the old catalpa tree out by your house. So he said, put a coat on. And I told him, I said, I don't want my face in these. I said, I'm moving away. I'm older now, and I'm moving into the West. So each of the images is with the back. And then he picked up some very nice, for example, he did several, with the catalpa tree, he added a couple of Celtic crosses, which I just love, things of that nature. So it came together, and I like it very much. Yeah. I'm very much fascinated by the mystery, which for me is the divine. The mystery means a lot of things to different people, but for me it's this sense of the search, the search for the ineffable, for God. And as a Catholic, coming out of a Catholic tradition, it's the sense of the sacramental vision of things. That is, the sense in which things are not just what they appear, but there's a felt presence in them. There's a sense in which the divine is everywhere. Now the question is, how do you articulate that? I was just looking at Paul Klee on the way over here, and I noticed that he was occupied with the same kinds of issues. And the various philosophers, Merleau-Ponty, all the way down the line, will articulate what it is that Klee is trying to do in the 1920s and the 30s. But I felt a kinship with what he was doing, and for me, it's the same kind of thing. For example, just an image, the image of the elevated, the 3rd Avenue elevated. Well, part of that is the whole play on El, which is Elohim, and the sense of the overshadowing. So I told Barry, somewhere you've got to get what looks like a cross in there, but not obvious. It can't be obvious, but if you look carefully, you'll begin to see it. And so we worked on that. And it's, I'm an American. I come out of a tradition of the confessionals, the autobiographical poets, Berryman, Hart Crane, Williams, Robert Lowell, then Hopkins, of course, in the British tradition. Seamus Heaney has meant a great deal to me, I must say. W.B. Yeats has meant a great deal. I used to teach them all the time at UMass. But all of these voices, and many, many more, Elizabeth Bishop, I could go on and on and on, but they've all added, like some kind of communion of saints almost, the communion of poets, adding to the available stock of reality. And this is, I wanted to get coming from a working class background, okay, I'm the oldest of seven children. My father was a mechanic, okay. My mother they both only went to the 9th grade. Then later my mother went back to school to become a nurse, okay. And my father was brilliant. I mean, brilliant. He could fix anything. I mean, he could watch somebody and then become a plumber. He could watch somebody and fix the most complicated carburetors on cars. He could be a carpenter. But growing up in the Depression, he didn't have the opportunity, to get the schooling. But I wanted to celebrate that language, just as Williams wanted to celebrate the language of New Jersey, Passaic and Patterson. I wanted to capture the language of New York, then of Western Massachusetts, and when I would go down, say I'd be giving readings, say in Georgia, to pick up a little bit of that, but to celebrate the actual living matrix of the language and get that in there. Now, on the other hand, I also wanted to say, okay, there's that, but I also, and this is part of my admiration for people like Hopkins and Hart Crane, to almost, to lift the language, to move it, say, in the direction of Wallace Stevens, to lift the language at moments, a kind of momentary transcendency, something of that nature. But then to get right back into the roots. In my family, writing poetry was not the thing you did, okay? I'll tell you a story. When I was about 16 years old, I was working with my father, and we were driving to work down in Merrick in a day camp, and he had a big dump truck, and he would take that dump truck into work all the time. And I would go with him, and I'd sit in the passenger seat. And one morning, he suddenly pulled the truck off the road, stops, turns off the engine, looks at me and says, "I hear you've been writing poetry." I said, "Well, yeah, Dad, I've been writing a couple." And he looks at me and he starts the engine up again, and he says, "All right, it's okay. You're still my son." So that gives you an idea, where I was coming from. I can still remember my father's Italian relatives coming over to the house. Johnny Stignari was one of them, and I was in college, and they would always ask me the same question: "When are you going to get a real job?" When I was I was in a kind of proto-seminary for a year when I was 16 and 17. And there was a $10 award given, first prize, by the sisters. There was a group of sisters or nuns, on the other side of town in Beacon, New York. And so I said, "Gee, I'm gonna try to write that poem, So I went to Brother Luke, and I said, "Brother, how do you write a poem?" And he said, "I don't know." He said, "But there's an anthology over there. Get this old big blue anthology with poems in it, and in the back it'll tell you what meter is and things like that." So pulled it out. I'm in the study hall and I'm reading it, and iambic pentameter and anapaests and trochees and stanzas and verse paragraphs and sestinas and villanelles and sonnets, etc. And I'm studying it, and I say, okay, I'm going to write a sonnet. And since it's Lent, I'm going to write a sonnet about the Passion of Jesus, okay? And I did. I wrote the sonnet, and it won, okay? And I got the $10, and I bought a rosary for my mother, who's Lutheran, so but she was very happy with it. But that began it. Then I put it aside because I had to get serious, as my dad wanted me to be. And so I said, okay, I won't write poetry, but I'm going to study poetry. But I'll be a teacher, and so I'll be making money. So the teaching came, and then, I got married, and I had the children, my 3 sons. But then when I was around 33, 34 years old, I said, if I'm ever going to write poetry, if I'm ever going to do this, I have to do it now because time is running out. By that time, I think I was already an associate professor. I'd had my first book out on Hopkins. I was about to get a second book out on William Carlos Williams. So that was settled. But the real love, the deep love, the thing that I really wanted to do was to write poetry. And I remember when my grandmother died, my mother's mother died, and I was sitting at the dining room table in my brother's house down in Baldwin, Long Island, and I just felt the need to somehow remember her, memorialize her in words. And so I wrote out a poem, and that was the beginning. Now the very special thing, Brendan, I think which sets me in some ways a little bit apart, okay, is when I was 35, the following year, Father Eddie Keyes asked me to become what they call a rector of a Cursillo weekend, a men's weekend. And I said, yeah, I was very honored, to do it. And the weekend went well. I mean, I think we really, the men, could feel the spirit on those 3 days. And then at the end of it, we would all go down into this small room like this, about this size, and there was a little makeshift tabernacle in the corner where the Blessed Sacrament was. And so I told everyone, I said, just, in your own heart, just ask for whatever you'd like, whatever grace you'd like to have. And I remember a very kind of strong impulse saying, okay, what do you want? What do you want? And I said, nothing, I'm happy. I'm glad I did this, And the voice said again, come on, Paul, is there something that you would like? And I said, well, yeah, there's one thing. I said, I'd like to write poems. I'd like to write poems, and I need your help. And not exactly a bargain, but the thing is, quid pro quo, but I would think of it as a prayer act, all right? And the weekend ended, etc. And in the next, I think, 6 months, I wrote my first book, which was very, very unusual for me, But that was a kind of sign, if you will, Brendan. But it's continued. Now, there have been times when it's been dry, but when I need to go to the well again, it seems to always be there. It still is, it seems. So because of that, that's why I mentioned that the autobiography is really in the Augustinian tradition. St. Augustine is a very important presence in terms of his own combination of the classics plus the Bible, okay, which I've tried to do. The classics in the Bible plus, as I say, to celebrate the idiom. Look, I got this from James Joyce. I mean, and so did William Carlos Williams. I mean, what Joyce did for Dublin, okay, is what Williams wanted to do for New Jersey, and what I would like to do for my, and he's a great model, for doing this. So that's kind of where it came from, Brennan. The God that I've come to know is someone I can talk to. Very often I find myself now, for the last, say, 10 years or so, waking up in the middle of the night and talking to him, talking to God. And just, because each day I'm aware of my failings, okay? I'm aware of my failings, and so I have two sources that remind me of my failings: my wife and God, but in a very good way. And I'll say, okay, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to put somebody down, or I don't want to be unkind to somebody, or if that person asks for the help, then try to give them the help, that kind of thing, okay? And the Bible, I must say, is very important. It's something that Eileen and we read the day's Mass each morning and then discuss it for about 25 minutes the epistles, the gospel, the collect, readings, that kind of thing for the day. And that, when I'm linked to that, when I'm linked to that spirit, then I feel most fully myself. And it's the same with the poetry. I mean, when I look back at the poetry, I see there are poems you write when you're 30 years old that you'd say, what was I thinking? There are some poems I put aside. They're sort of like the kind of things that you wish you hadn't said, maybe, or that you'd said better. Okay, that sort of thing. And so for me, when I'm really in a poem, it's the same as like being in the middle of a prayer. It really is. That doesn't necessarily mean, Brendan, that all the poems are going to be quote religious poems, except maybe in some very, very deep sense. Okay, they could deal with a landscape. They could deal with a dog. They could deal with my grandchildren. They could, but as I get older, I find myself coming back to, like, last year I was 2 years ago I was in Gloucester, and I wrote a poem after listening to the talks by this priest and by this laywoman, and it was simply the idea of going out deeper. Just going out deeper, and that's what I'm trying to do, is to go out, go deeper. And I think many poets would say, yes, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go deeper into the, quote, deeper reality. It's not just the surface, clearly. There's, and you know what? The thing is, when you go down there, suddenly you notice that God is looking at you, and he's been waiting there, or very often it'll be the feminine, it'll be Mary, But it's that sense that gives me a consolation. Hopkins obviously has been very important to me. George Herbert is important. In some ways, so is John Donne. But so are Isaac Rosenberg, who died in the trenches. So are Wilfred Owen. Seamus Heaney, who were both, he's only like 6 months older than I am, and I've watched him a whole lifetime, admired him deeply for what he's been able to accomplish. So very often the poems will be talking to these people, to see what they can come up with. That's something I must say. It seems to when I think of where did that happen and why did that happen. One of the things that comes to mind, Brendan, is, again, the Cursillo. Because if you're going to talk to men who are both, on the one hand, say lawyers, or they may be, truck drivers, or they may be school teachers, or, they may have already spent 20 years in AA, so that if you start to throw the bull, they'll cut right through it. You know what I mean? And this is good. This is actually... So you say, okay, who am I talking to here? Am I talking to myself? Am I trying to, quote, impress somebody? Why not try to get at the heart of what's real? We don't live forever, So this is the chance to do it. And I think we have like meetings. Now there are only 4 of us left, okay? And we've been meeting for many, many years. And we'll just talk about, the kids growing up, and then the grandkids, and then facing mortality, And we try to be, just be honest about it. I myself have never been in AA, but I've had relatives who have. And just listening to them in their recovery has struck me the need to be honest, that you can't BS yourself on this. John Berryman, for example, who drank so much, would always say that the reason he drank was because he was exhausted, and it was a reward for that, And then even when he was in the hospital and he would teach, he would ask the cab driver who took him to the classes at the University of Minnesota to stop at a bar on the way back so that he could just refresh himself with about 6 shots. So he got nowhere that way until finally the Episcopal priest who was his counselor said, "You're not going to class anymore. I'll take over your classes if necessary. But John, you're only hurting yourself." And he talks about this in an unfortunately not finished novel, his last novel called Recovery, because he just couldn't handle it anymore, Brendan. But that sense in which he talks about setting yourself up, imaginatively on a screen and seeing yourself at the center of things and realizing what a fool you've been, you're not getting to the truth. So for me, Brendan, the poetry has to speak to other human beings. I'm not a language poet. I love language. I respect it. But if I can't communicate with another human being, then I've failed personally. That's at the heart of it right there. And in that way, I think Yeats, Heaney, I think of Shakespeare, Dante. My models are the ones who, in fact, did this. Yeah. I've given a lot of poetry readings over the years, Brendan. For about 20 years, I was at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. And so every year that meant, you gave a reading there. But I've been asked by a lot of colleges, universities around the country, in Europe, in Canada, to give poetry readings. And for me, if I'm going to address an audience, and here's where Robert Frost comes in, there's a sense in which the poetry should be accessible. The audience should be able to hear it, and it should be spoken in a human voice in the context of the situation that you are addressing in the poem. So yeah, I watch actors, and I say there's a lot to be learned from actors in terms of presenting poetry. A poetry reading, the last thing a poetry reading needs to be is boring. And I've seen a lot of those, Brendan. It should leave the audience thinking and perhaps even stunned, if you can do it. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'll just want to, when we walk together, I'll tell you a little bit about this, Brendan, for background. I stole this from Genesis, okay? Okay. There's a passage that's always struck me in Genesis, before the fall, where Adam and Eve, man and woman, are walking with God in the cool of the evening, okay? And just that image of, we'll go for walks. I do a lot of gardening, and I love to plant flowers for her, and herbs, and heirloom tomatoes. And I love her to come out and look at them and then just be able to, pick them. But that sense of just being so blessed to have this woman in my life, it's 49 years, it'll be 50 next year. Just to have grown over the years so deeply in love with this woman. So I just wanted to celebrate that with this poem. When we walk together in the cool of the evening, walk together, you and I, in the cool of the evening. After the heat of the day, after the long hours under the sweating sun, after the buzzing words like black flies had at long last ceased their querulous stinging, after the questions, after the answers that refused at last to answer anything at all, in the cool of the evening, when we walked in the garden, you and I, in the cool of the evening. When it was no longer important for either of us to speak, since the words, whatever words they might have been, would have been beside the point, would have said nothing our hearts did not already know. We're simply being there, in the cool of the evening, was all that finally mattered. With the long night coming on, and the last trill of bird song fading off in the distance by the ridge of the tree line, when we walked together there in the garden in the cool of the evening, you and I. Wolf Moon, yes, this is really it's about my father, it's about my father-in-law, and it's about my mother-in-law. They were all failing at the same time. My mom had died at the age of 65 years before, but I was watching now as I know that they were, knew that they were approaching the end time. My father, 2 months shy now of his 85th, lies weighted down by 2 blown knees, edema, arthritis, loss of hearing, emphysema, reduced to wearing sweatpants underneath his shift to keep some shred of dignity in a hospital 400 miles south of where I live. Groan after garbled groan spills into my telephone, mixed with clumps of undigested syllables. Once again, my bewildered wife has gone to stay with her father, diagnosed with cancer of the lung, and her mild mother who lully drifts among the stars and then back to a rockabye bed in Rockaway. Wolf moon, prowling the evening sky as you have these 60 Januaries past, above abandoned rooms where I have passed 60 years in some. Tell me, once more, why what happens has to happen. Tell me, bitter moon, why the old keep moving up the line, dazed with sluggish fear. Proffer me some drugged truth I can bear, as now they fall away and we limp up the line to die. Maresy does and dozy dotes and little damsy divey. That's the, and I'm 4 years old when I remember this, and it's about trying to understand something as simple as a lyric, okay, but trying to understand language as a young child learns more and more about language. And that's going to continue all my life as I try to understand language more and more. But it's also the mystery of who is this man up in front? It's my father, Paul, and my uncle, Louis, who's also my godfather, Paul Louis Mariani. These are the names I have been given. So when I hear the name Paul, I look around to see if who's calling me. We all do this, right? So it has to do with that sense of, it's comic, it's a mystery, and I'm an older man now. I'm in my late 60s writing this poem, and I'm looking back and they're gone now, so I can't ask them anything more. And yet there's still been a sense that I was privileged enough to know them, that they were part of my life, the only life I have. So I thought I would put this poem first, because all of those themes that I've mentioned, Brendan, are going to continue to resonate, or I hope they do, all the way through the book, right through the last poem. And here it is. Maresy dotes. Rewind, recording angel, and play again the roll and rise of Maresy dotes. The lilt and lift of those honeyed voices soothing to a small boy in the back seat listening. The Andrews sisters in dozy dotes. The whole harmonium of bird notes floating from the radio of my father's all-black pre-war Ford those 60 years ago. They make no sense, the syllables that sing little lambsy divey, and yet, angel, how they terrify and comfort. Behind the wheel, my father's laughing at something his brother riding shotgun. A cigarette clenched between his gleaming teeth is said. They're making jokes of words, which I can no more understand than the song the Trinity of Sisters sing. Down the wobbling vortex of memory, The wheels go round and round, bumping over New York's ancient cobble streets. From above, the latticed gaps of the 3rd Avenue L as shuttered sunlight flickers. Where we've gone, or where we're going, I cannot tell. Nor can I now recall a word of what they said then, Angel, though you know that I was there. Only splintered sounds sloughing on the summer air and laughter, like a shattered symphony forming and reforming. Paul to the left and Louis to the right. These two, whose names I carry with me everywhere I go. Names by which the self is fated to be blessed and cursed. Recalled by flickers, if at all. 3 bird notes by which the soul is summoned. Mares eat oats, and does eat oats, and little lambs eat ivy. The nursling music reconfigures to reveal at last a meaning for the boy, which tells him only this, that the animals were hungry and had been fed. Up front, there's that mix of English and Italian laced with French, the odd patois their parents brought with them when they left Compiano. And now, in memory's rear-view mirror after all this time, I catch my father's beseeching eyes dart in my direction from death's shadows, while Louis, 60 anni fa, turns towards me, as if to let me in on something he's just said. But there's too much clack and static, as now his head falls back on his pillow in the casket. That's it. That's all I can recover. The flecked film frozen in blacks and whites and sepias, like some Roman ruin crumbling on a darkling plain over which the waves of time are lashing. 2 shadows only, caught on this cloudy, moonlit midnight here by the cold July Atlantic, like the changing light of the overarching L. And I alone left to tell this story, in which their names are entered, these two who follow me everywhere I go, answering still, as mares and does and lambs answer when they're called, by force of awe, or fear, or love, or hunger, hoping to be fed. Oh yes, Angel, hoping to be fed.